Hello and welcome. My name is Ellen with Ellen Estelle, and today I'm going to be showing you how to sew Vogue V9288. This is a very easy missus cape with a matching belt that has a really nice detail of button front closure, as well as this faux front. This pattern calls for medium weight woolens, fleece, denim, and is unsuitable for obvious diagonals. Now, this fabric I purchased from S.R. Harris. It is a Donna Karan fabric that is completely reversible. What I love about this jacquard kind of brocade fabric is that it has a really pretty shimmery metallic silver thread throughout. And not only that, but even though it is double-sided, it's really lightweight and kind of flowy. Now, in the original pattern, the cape extends all the way down the shoulder seam, but I chose to create a slit so that I could have my arms come through it. I used a double fold bias binding all the way around. And the bias binding I actually used from when I was making masks. I had a lot of different colors of bias binding, as well as giant rolls of black and white. So in order to recycle and reuse, I chose to do that. The tie I also chose to make two of because I wanted to be able to reverse the cape and reverse the belt. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there are pockets along the front here. And I will also show you how I did pockets on the reverse. So the cape is actually buttoned on. It is completely open here. Notice you've got a collar, and since it's double-sided, I chose to do a black button on the white side and a white button on the black side. Now, this is probably one of the parts that I missed the most about New York, was all of the different trims and fabrics that you can find in the garment district. So I wore this cape for New York Fashion Week in September of 2021. So when I flew into New York, I obviously knew I was coming, and so I knew where to go. I chose to go to Pacific Trims over on 38th Street, and I found these really nice big plastic buttons. They're about an inch and a quarter in size. I ended up getting 10 of each color. So I was in New York. I had already made these buttonholes because I knew what size button I needed. And when I got there, I bought the buttons, and then I sat in my hotel room and sewed these on the day before the show. In this tutorial, I will also show you, I end up using the bias binding along the center back seam here on the black. As you can see on the white, you don't notice anything because it's pressed, and I wanted to leave it that way. And so I chose to use the black bias binding on the black side so it would be less noticeable. All you'll see is a row of stitching here. And then I also chose to use my tag on both sides since it is reversible. Keep watching to learn more.
First, we're going to start out by cutting out the pattern pieces. The back bodice pieces are fairly large and require the fabric to be unfolded and cut out one at a time. Be sure to flip your pattern piece over when cutting out the second piece. And then cut and fuse your interfacing pieces to your fabric. With right sides together, sew the bodice back pieces together at the center back seam. Press the seam flat and finish the raw edge. I chose to cover the raw edge with double folded bias binding that I had left over from making masks. Although double folded is not necessary, it does ensure that the seam allowance is fully enclosed. Whether using single or double fold bias binding, be sure to cut off the excess seam allowance to ensure that no threads or raw edges poke through. To use the double folded tape, I first opened up the tape and sewed one of the folded edges to the seam allowance, matching the raw edges and sewing as close to the fold as possible. Then, once the tape is sewn, fold the tape over the raw edge like so. In order to minimize my stitching lines showing, I sewed the folded edge of the bias binding down as close to the folded edge as possible. That way, on the other side, the only thing you should see is the seam and one row of stitching. Next, place your bodice front pieces with right sides together and sew along the shoulder seam. I chose to stop the seam right above my elbow so I could put my arm through the cape. Once I sewed both sides together, I pressed the seam allowance flat and repeated the bias binding method for the shoulder seam allowance. Then I used the double folded bias binding to finish the raw edges of the entire cape. Using a walking foot as shown here really helped to ensure that my fabric was not stretched out during this process. It is important to be especially careful at the center front and corners. Sewing the bias binding at the corner of the arm slits proved to be a challenge. I learned to make sure to leave a tail at the end of the shoulder seam binding if you do this method to ensure that there are no raw edges showing. Through trial and error, I was able to fold the bias binding at a 90-degree angle, much like the corners of the cape as shown. Using the seam ripper as a guide and plenty of clips, I was able to sew the binding at a 90-degree angle by lifting my presser foot and continuing the stitching line like this. Next, you want to sew your tie with right sides together along one of the short ends like this. Be sure to press the seam allowance and finish the raw edge. Then, fold the tie in half lengthwise and sew all along the raw edges, leaving about 1 inch of space in your stitching line. Finish the raw edges, making sure to leave the gap open. Since I was using double-sided fabric, I decided to make 2 ties with both colors. Then, using the 1 inch gap, pull the tie right sides out and press like so. Hand stitch the gap closed. Now for the pockets, finish the raw edges. Then, sew a basting stitch or the longest stitch length possible all along the curved edge. Pull on the bottom thread to curve the pocket inward. This will help when sewing. Then, press the curve edge flat. There should be about 5/8 of an inch seam allowance pressed under, including the flat top edge. Sew a line of stitching at the top edge at about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then, follow the markings at the center front pattern piece and line up the pockets at the center front panel. I chose to sew the pockets on both sides of my panel since I wanted the cape to be reversible. This meant that I lined up the pockets on both sides and stitched all the way through both pockets along the curved edges at about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, leaving the top open like this. Talk about camouflage. Finish the raw edges of the panel with the bias binding. Next, we're going to do the cape plackets for the button closure. Fold down one of the long raw edges at 5/8 of an inch, then fold the placket in half lengthwise with right sides together. Sew one of the short ends at 5/8 of an inch and then trim the folded corner at a 45-degree angle like this. Then fold and press the placket right side out. To attach the placket to the cape, match up the long raw edge and pin, lining up the top edges. Sew at 5/8 of an inch and press the raw edge in towards the placket. Finish the placket by either hand stitching or stitch in the ditch, catching the previously folded edge. Next, sew one of your collar pieces to the front bodice at the neckline. Press the raw edges up. Then, pin your other collar piece with right sides together. Sew all the way around at 5/8 of an inch, leaving the bottom edge free. Fold your collar right side out and press all the edges nice and square. Finish the same way as the placket. Sew your cape collar with right sides together at 5/8 of an inch and leave the bottom edge open, just like your bodice front collar piece. Attach it to your cape in the same manner. The final step is to sew your buttonholes and your buttons on the marks indicated on your pattern. And there you have it! Vogue V9288 is a show-stopping cape with amazing potential. Until next time, be sure to like and subscribe.